You're watching Maverick Media. Educate, organize, act.
Joining Pulse TV. I'm Cindy Peister. We're here today in Venice. We've met up with journalist Robert Parry, who is our guest on the show today. And Robert is a longtime independent journalist. He broke some of the major stories from the Iran-Contra scandal, which is a big part of American history, which is still playing out. Robert Parry is also an author of 3 books. His latest one, just coming out, is Neck Deep, The Disastrous Presidency of George W. Bush. We are so honored to have Robert. He's also the winner of the George Polk Award, a very prestigious award, which puts him in a category with some of our very best journalists in this country. So, ladies and gentlemen, Robert Parry.
Thank you.
You've been at this for so long. I mean, with Iran-Contra for all these decades, really, you've been bringing the truth to the American people, or trying to bring the truth to the American people. How did we get in the position we are now? How did we get from there to here, where there's so much that the American people are not aware of, that the media isn't getting out to us, that maybe our government is lying to us here or there, and so frequently that people don't feel they can even trust the government at all anymore. So how did we get here?
Well, a good starting point is to go back to the Vietnam era, when the American people were very engaged. Millions and millions of people were trying to stop the Vietnam War. There were a number of underground publications that were making the case, explaining to people why the war was wrong. You had the mainstream media responding to that, starting to reflect some of that anger and concern. You had in that era stories that were coming out that were really exposing some of the illegal and improper things that the U.S. government had done. You had Dan Ellsberg, for instance, leaking the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times and other newspapers. That led President Richard Nixon to respond with an aggressive attempt to try to discredit Ellsberg and start the Plumbers Unit, which led ultimately to him turning that on his political enemies like the Democrats in the '72 election. You had the Washington Post stepping forward with Woodward and Bernstein digging into that, exposing how Nixon had abused his powers. The Watergate scandal ended up driving Nixon from office. In the wake of that, you had someone like Cy Hirsch, who had been working at Dispatch News, kind of an underground wire service, where he'd written about the My Lai massacre. He's then hired by the New York Times. So you had this sort of building of people in both the progressive community, but also the mainstream press, digging out information that was important to the American people. Hirsch did a number of stories about abuses committed by the Central Intelligence Agency, exposing that to the American people. Now, these developments were quite shocking to many members of the American establishment. You had a population that was increasingly out of control. You had a press corps that was digging into the darkest secrets of the government, exposing what some of the businesses were doing in collusion with the government. So that had to be reversed. And what we start seeing as we get to the mid and late 1970s was an effort to sort of start turning that around. The 1970s also was a time when the Cold War was perceived as ending. The Soviet Union was seen as by the Central Intelligence Agency and many analysts as having lost the Cold War, that it was no longer the threatening force that people had thought it might have been back in the 50s and 60s. You had even Nixon and Kissinger and President Ford talking about détente, the idea that they could work with the Soviet Union to negotiate some of the most dangerous aspects of the Cold War. So you had a very interesting moment, but that also had to be reversed by as far as the people who were invested in the Cold War were concerned. The military-industrial complex, some of the old Cold Warriors, some of the think tanks that had made a lot of money and been very successful in exaggerating the dangers of the Soviet Union. So they tried to come back. And you see even as early as 1976, where some of these old Cold Warriors and a new group that we now know as the neoconservatives began to come together. There was an effort inside the CIA to have a challenge to the CIA analysts who were seeing this Soviet decline. It was called Team B, and under then CIA Director George H.W. Bush, this team of Cold Warriors and people like Paul Wolfowitz, one of the early neocons, were allowed to see the raw material, and their conclusions were the opposite of what the CIA analysts were coming up with. Instead of saying the Soviet Union was in decline, these analysts said, these outsiders said, the Soviet Union was 10 feet tall, was about to take over the world, and we better build up our military again to thwart them. So that became sort of the pressure that we see in the late 1970s, going into the period when Ronald Reagan, who challenged Ford in '76, ultimately gets the Republican nomination in 1980 and begins to push for reestablishing this kind of fearful America, building up the military again, investing huge amounts of money in weaponry to somehow challenge the Soviet Union and to fight them in all these little places around the world, like Central America or Angola or Mozambique or all these third world countries that were now being put in play by the Reagan people, with the idea that that was needed to stop the Soviet Union and defeat them in this global battle, which many people thought had been pretty much ended. So we had this sort of pushback. There was also an effort by some of the Republicans, people like former Treasury Secretary William Simon, to pull together resources from the foundations, Smith Richardson, Olin, Scaife, to begin to invest in media apparatus. And they began to build magazines, and they set up attack groups to go after mainstream journalists who might be reporting things that would be considered unfavorable to these propagandists. So you had that evolving in that period too. And simultaneously, the American left tended to withdraw. Many of the underground publications of the 70s were shut down or sold off. Even some long-standing operations like the New Republic was sold to Marty Peretz, a neoconservative. So instead of the New Republic being a home for strong liberal opinion, it became the place for Charlie Krauthammer and Fred Barnes to sort of develop their skills. So we started seeing this evolution, going back to kind of this fearful Cold Warrior status. And essentially to sort of how do you get rid of the Vietnam syndrome became a big factor for many of the conservatives in that time frame. And under Reagan, once he became president, this sort of meshed with efforts inside the government to sort of get the American people scared again. There was a concept that was being pushed by some of the people inside the Reagan camp called perception management. The idea was if you could manage the perceptions of the American people and make them scared enough about these various threats abroad, whether in Central America or someplace else, that they would then support building up the military and doing what Reagan said was necessary. So ultimately, you start going through this time period, and it becomes harder and harder to do the kinds of stories that the press was doing back in the 1970s. I was with the Associated Press during this period, and I was on the special assignment team. And in trying to dig into some of these stories became something that was more and more of a career risk. And a lot of journalists who tried to do these stories ended up having very bad outcomes. One of the famous cases dealt with Raymond Bonner, who was a New York Times correspondent in Central America. And he was describing these death squad activities that were underway by right-wing governments supported by the Reagan administration. And that wasn't acceptable to the Reagan people. So they began to attack him. They had their outside groups try to question his ethics and the quality of his journalism. And when he did a major piece about a massacre that had occurred in 1981 at a place called El Mozote, And he exposed this in early '82, just as Reagan was putting out a report saying that the Salvadoran military was now acting in respect of human rights. That was very embarrassing for the Reagan people, so they went after Ray Bonner even more. And ultimately, the New York Times, which had an executive editor, Abe Rosenthal, who was also sympathetic to the neoconservative cause, basically Bonner was pulled out, given a humiliating assignment, and ultimately forced out of the New York Times. And that kind of message was being sent to all of us, that if you really cared about your career, you don't go to certain places. You don't write certain stories. Some of us kept trying to do it, but it became increasingly hard.
In terms of Bonner that you brought up, the journalist Bonner, he was vindicated. Could you just briefly tell us how he was vindicated?
Well, the story of the El Mozote massacre was that roughly 800 Salvadorans were taken by the Salvadoran military, which was conducting an offensive just before Christmas 1981. And they were brought into this town of El Mozote. There were the fathers, the men, the women, and the children. And first the Salvadoran military executed the men in front of their families. Then they killed the women. Some were raped. Then they murdered the children. Many were burned alive in a church where they were locked. Others were bludgeoned to death. It was a horrible, horrible massacre. And it was part of an effort by the Salvadoran military at that time to show, here's what happens to you if you're seen as being sympathetic to the guerrillas. When Bonner disclosed this, because he went actually to the scene and got enough testimony from survivors, there was one woman who had survived, who had witnessed much of this, and got other information, then he was attacked by the Reagan administration for basically making it up. And so the El Mozote story was left in that sort of hazy area. While there was a lot of evidence to support it, there was also these attacks on it by the U.S. government. Bonner was sort of pulled out of El Salvador in disgrace, driven out of the New York Times. He became a freelancer for quite a few years. So there were reasons to think that, well, maybe it didn't happen. Maybe the Reagan administration was telling the truth. Bonner was off on some wild tangent. But at the end of the Salvadoran Civil War in 1990, a UN forensic team was brought in to investigate some of the worst massacres of that war, and they went to El Mozote, and they dug up the skeletons, including the skeletons of many children. So Bonner was vindicated. He was also quickly rehired by the New York Times at about that point, because they didn't want to be seen as, they didn't want that full story to come out that they had basically persecuted some reporter who had done his job right. So that's how the game was being played, but Bonner was vindicated by that UN report at the end of the Salvadoran War.
And you yourself had the experience of being shut down for some of the stories that you put out.
Right. Basically, in the 1980s, there was this effort by the Reagan administration to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. It had been taken over by a leftist group called the Sandinistas. And the Reagan administration began to support a group that was known as the Contras, and they were based mostly in Honduras, somewhat in Costa Rica. And they were being backed first by the Argentine Secret Services, and later by the CIA. And they were being sent into Nicaragua to wreak havoc, basically to destabilize the country, with the goal that they would maybe win eventually and drive the Sandinistas out. So the Congress, which was still controlled by the Democrats, at least in the House side at that point, tried to prevent this effort. There was a concern that there might be a new Vietnam, that the United States would be drawn into this conflict in a way that would cause more Americans to die. The Vietnam syndrome was still alive and well, if you will. So Congress tried to stop this effort. They felt it was also wrong to overthrow of another country, another government. And Reagan then had to find ways around it. So he began to figure out secret ways to fund the Contras. And one thing that we were doing at the Associated Press was trying to track where the money was coming from, because it was no longer coming from the Congress. How was the Reagan administration carrying out this secret war? So we began searching for the money. And I was working with Brian Barger at the time, and we stumbled upon the fact that some of the Contras were increasing their money by being involved in the drug trade. And because they had this special relationship with the U.S. government, the drug traffickers knew that if they could use the Contras as sort of a cover, they could then move their drugs more safely into the United States. And that, in fact, is what happened. When they get caught or when there'd be a problem, the CIA might step in and say, let's let this one go for the good of the country. We don't want to have the embarrassing publicity. So it became a useful way for some of the drug traffickers to get their drugs into the U.S. markets. So we stumbled upon that story and had trouble getting it out, but ultimately did. We also were following how Ollie North was conducting his business with other fundraising operations to keep the Contras in play. But ultimately, what led to the exposure of Iran-Contra was kind of an accident, in part because the New York Times and the Washington Post had now moved farther and farther away from being willing to do these kinds of stories. The Reagan administration flatly denied our stories. There was a sense that you don't want to go there. There was a lot of sympathy, frankly, at senior levels of those news organizations for Reagan's idea of reasserting American power. So it wasn't that you had the liberal press, which is often what the right has tried to tell us. You actually had a press corps that was very sympathetic to an aggressive American foreign policy. And when stories came out that went against that or made that look bad, it was not well received at the higher levels of the news outlets. So eventually, what brought the Iran-Contra scandal out was that after the Congress had been sort of beaten into restoring aid to the Contras, the Democrats finally caved on that. It was in 1986. But one of North's last flights, dropping guns to the Contras, was shot down by some kid, a Sandinista draftee who was still a teenager, and they'd given him a SAM missile, and he fired it at this plane that he saw flying over, and it hit the plane, to his amazement, and the plane began crashing. One of the people on board, Eugene Hasenfuss, had a parachute and was able to bail out of the plane and came down and was captured and began talking. And the crew had taken a number of their documents with them, so the Sandinistas recovered from the plane a number of the records. Barger and I went down and were given by the Sandinistas these records. So we began then tracing back again, finding out there was this intricate arrangement for secretly running a war that had been kept from the American people and hidden from Congress. So even then, the White House continued to deny. A month or so later, there was a disclosure in a Beirut newspaper about another secret operation, which was the Reagan administration secretly selling weapons to the Iranians and using the profits. We later found out that they were using some of the profits to help the Contras. So it became the Iran-Contra affair. But what we really were seeing was a reassertion by the Reagan administration and the neoconservatives around him of the imperial presidency that had been essentially beaten back after Nixon's failure. There was an effort to rebuild it and restore it and operate outside the law again. So that became with the Iran-Contra scandal, there was a chance that we could expose that in a more full way and show the problem. But by then, the right-wing media had built up to such a level, and the mainstream press had gotten rather cowardly, and the progressive media had pretty much shut down. So the Reagan people were able to block many of the most serious aspects of that investigation. And they were able to essentially make it very boring to the American people, confusing. And those of us trying to follow it essentially lost the battle of getting at the truth. Even though we would keep moving step by step forward, the assaults on us became pretty hard to absorb. We were accused of trying to undermine the president, being damaging to the country, and the American press corps just didn't want to do that anymore. It became like a very hard thing to maintain your career when you were facing those kinds of assaults. I moved on to Newsweek during this period and encountered inside Newsweek even worse situation than I saw at AP. Some of the top executives at Newsweek were very much in support of Reagan's policies. They liked the idea of an aggressive foreign policy. And the idea of telling stories that exposed the dark side of that were just not very acceptable. So I battled through that for a number of years and ultimately left Newsweek in 1990, feeling that essentially at that point the mainstream American press corps had lost its way, that we had gone a very far distance from what had happened in the 1970s. And about that point in the early 90s, we also saw now the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, see an opening to destroyed the Vietnam syndrome once and for all, as the phrase went. There was a case where Saddam Hussein in Iraq invaded Kuwait. President George H.W. Bush moved to counter that, to drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait. There was a lot of bombing of the Iraqi forces. And when you get to this period in early 1991, the generals on the ground, the American generals, General Schwarzkopf and others, felt that there was no need to have a ground war. That there was an offer from Soviet President Gorbachev to negotiate basically a withdrawal of the Iraqi forces to save lives. The Iraqis would leave behind their weapons and move out. And Schwarzkopf tried to convince the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, to help him make this case to the president. And so Schwarzkopf thinks he has Powell on his side. And Powell goes over to the Oval Office and walks in on a meeting where President Bush is upset about this peace deal from Gorbachev. He wants to have a ground war. He feels that that's very important for the American psyche to actually have a conflict where the United States troops wipe out the enemy. But he doesn't want to also entirely alienate Gorbachev. So President Bush is looking for a solution. And Colin Powell raises his hand and says, well, Mr. President, we could give them 1 day to withdraw. And they couldn't do that, so then we could go ahead with the invasion, with our counter-invasion, our attack. And Bush says, that's a great idea, Colin. And he goes out and announces at the White House that the Iraqis have 1 day to withdraw their forces. And back in Saudi Arabia, the generals, Schwarzkopf and others, look at each other and say, well, we're going to go to war. And in fact, they do. And they move in and they essentially annihilate the overwhelmed Iraqi forces. Tens of thousands are killed. Mostly these are draftees from Iraq. And Bush then calls the end of the conflict after 100 hours, after we've shown that we could do this. 180 or so Americans die. And Bush then goes out to announce this victory. And some of the first words out of his mouth are, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. And the significance of that is that this has been what they were after all along. They wanted to get back control of the American people, to get the American people back behind this idea of America as a powerful imperial force in the world, willing to take on these other countries and do so very effectively. And after the Persian Gulf War was won and the troops came home, there were these celebrations. At the Washington Mall, there were tanks, so your kids could go play on the tanks. They had major fireworks displays. They had ticker tape parades for Colin Powell and General Schwarzkopf. They tried to make war fun again. And basically they succeeded. Americans sort of now became more enthusiastic about war. They began to identify with the brave young men and women in uniform. So it made future efforts much more sellable. The Vietnam experience had been forgotten, put in the past. And all these things that had happened over those 2 decades or so had been designed to achieve just that result. So when you get to the point of Bill Clinton coming into office and the Democrats essentially, at least briefly, sort of taking back control of the government, that was the reality they faced. And Clinton did not want to anymore just expose the criminality of some of the Reagan-Bush activities than the Republicans did. Clinton felt that to go dig into to Iran-Contra further, to dig into the Contra drug trafficking problem, to dig into the Iraq-Gate issue. And Iraq-Gate was another scandal where during the 80s, Reagan secretly was arming Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which came to look pretty stupid once the U.S. had to go to war with the Iraqis. So that had to be covered up, and Clinton went along with most of that because he felt it was good for the bipartisanship. He thought he could work with these people. He had other things on his agenda like health care, and he thought he could get the Republicans to be supportive. The Republicans by this point had built up such a powerful media apparatus of their own with think tanks and all kinds of ways of getting their message out. At this point, we'd moved far beyond just magazines and newspapers. Now we had talk radio at play. Rush Limbaugh was out there, and so were a number of other right-wing talk radio people pounding away at Clinton and the Democrats. was setting up the stage for '94 and the Republican Revolution when they took over the Congress. So you had this major shift in how America was functioning. I must say also that the progressive community in general, there are obviously exceptions, but they had not really responded. There wasn't much pushback. Essentially, the progressive position was that the mainstream press should do this job, that the politicians should, get some spine and stand up for these things. But, the way people really are, if they're looking at the possibility of losing their job and their paycheck, or losing an election and being humiliated, they tend to try to do what they can to avoid that. Most people do. There are heroes, there are people that are brave and stand up, but most of them were being wiped out. So they became an example of a different sort. If you stood up to them, see what happens, the Ray Bonner kind of examples. Later on, there was the Gary Webb example, when Gary Webb for the San Jose Mercury News revived our old stories about Contra drug trafficking in the mid-90s. He was then attacked viciously and had his career cut short. Ultimately, he committed suicide. But those kinds of painful experiences were the message that people were getting. So if you wanted to do the right thing, there was a very high price for it. And you could make a lot of money and be very respected and be on TV if you played ball. So the rewards were one way, the punishments were the other. They were the reverse from what we might want to see. If you did the right thing, you were punished. If you did the wrong thing and played ball with the wrong points of view and did what they wanted, the rewards were enormous.
So we've come an awfully long ways in the sense that because of that whole direction to cover up the truth, to keep the American people blind, to make war sellable, people like yourselves have had your stories really repressed. And so I have to thank you, we all have to thank you for keeping at it all of these decades. I really do appreciate that.